Bryan, and that was the opening of the first movement of Prokofiev's Flute Sonata. I'm going to talk you through this first movement and give you some ideas and some tips which I feel make this piece really come to life. I'll go through a lot of the details in the piece, and I'll try and demonstrate a few places as well, although I apologise in advance as I always find talking and playing consecutively really tricky. But why don't we start from the beginning and talk through the opening. So I think it's really important when we approach any piece of music to start by thinking, what do I want to say? What do I want the character to feel like at the beginning of the piece? And for me, even though it's marked mezzo forte, it doesn't want to be too strident because we've got a long way to go in terms of the whole sonata. It's about 28 minutes, so we don't want to give everything right at the start. So I think it has a slightly sort of a questioning feel, like a sort of beginning of a long journey. So I think not too much vibrato, not too heavy on the vibrato, just something quite sort of simple and innocent. I think it's important not to be too rubato with the semiquavers. If we pull that around too much before we've kind of even got going, I think it can make us feel a little bit seasick. One very important thing in bar 3, this figure, it really needs to be on the last quaver of the bar. Quite often I hear it played and it's a little bit early because it is fast. Try and really be precise on rhythms. Prokofiev is actually a very easy composer to play in some ways because he is so detailed and precise with his markings. So rhythmically as well, I think it's important that we really adhere to the rhythms on the page. He's also very specific with markings, tenutos and accents, which come all over the place through the piece. So I think let's try and really make a difference between a tenuto and an accent. So here is a little accent, but then nice tenuto. So we'll keep those a little bit kind of like a nice full bow on the tenutos rather than an attack. When we have this little figure, nice staccato on the last triplet. Nice and clear on the top Ds, and then again a nice bouncy accent on that low D. Figure 1, I feel, is slightly more introverted, so I think we can bring the dynamic right down as he marks their piano, but also slightly change the character to slightly being a bit more unsure, maybe. Tonguing here, there are a lot of repeated notes, and I think we sometimes underestimate how precise we need to be when notes are repeated. So make sure that articulation is clear enough. Obviously at tempo it will flow better than that, but just make sure you're really hearing that second repeated note. Prokofiev doesn't necessarily mark dynamic changes when actually a kind of colour change is felt. So don't be afraid to, follow the sense of line through and change the colour. A case in point is this place, which is 5 bars after 1, which I think should feel a bit more hollow, a bit more kind of nervous maybe than the previous entry 4 bars earlier. Also, that gives us a lower starting point for this crescendo, which is only on 2 quavers at the end of the next bar. So we really need to explode over the end of that bar so that we can be really forte and a totally different character in the next bar, something much more demonstrative, slightly angrier. quite a lot in that phrase. I think make sure that your breathing becomes expressively the same as you're playing. So you allow the breathing to kind of carry the phrase through as much as possible. I think we are, as flute players, I notice this more than other instrumentalists, but we are very apologetic about our breathing. And there's no need for that to be the case. I think actually we need to celebrate our breathing and make it very much part of musically what we're doing, just as a singer would do. So in this section, or in any section in this movement, when you're playing bigger, make sure your breathing matches that. So really kind of take a breath that inspires the next note. After figure 2, the dynamic comes right down, and again, it's not just a dynamic change, it's a total character change. So think about perhaps how your vibrato could come into play here as well. So if we're doing something that creates a much sweeter sound. So either less vibrato or maybe just something very, again, violinistic, I sometimes compare to string instruments. So that it's not a thick, heavy vibrato that's weighing the sound down. We want the sound to really float through. Rhythmically in this section, make sure that you're not playing triplets. Ya, ba, bee, ba, bee, ba, ba. It's a bit Teddy Bear's Picnic. Doom, ba, da, 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 dee. So we want to keep this ya, ba, da, da, dee. That's very much alive, because that will give the phrase that kind of special sparkle that it needs to really feel like it's carrying us through to this next section. A couple of details just before we get to the end of this first page. Again, Prokofiev is such a quirky composer, and he throws in these little accents and tenutos. Try not to miss that. Yada, yada, just really kick that accent so we hear it. And then a couple of bars later again, tenutos again. Yada, so full bows. Don't take these tenutos for granted. We really need to work them. I often say to my students, imagine that your listener has a blank score. So all the notes, but none of the markings, dynamics, articulation, any of these little details. And they would have to put all these details in by listening to you play. I think that's quite a good tip to make sure that you really do enough of all of these small details. I obviously didn't do the repeat that time, but I think when you do the repeat in performance, you can think a little bit perhaps differently about the sound or the vibrato at the beginning the second time, so that you're not just delivering exactly the same thing as you did the first time. And that, I think that's always important in music, that we feel like what we're playing is fresh and spontaneous. Don't be predictable to your listener. When we get to this next section at figure 4, something new again. So I think try, even though it's marked forte, try not to be too aggressive with the sound. We're kind of excited but not angry here. So instead of sort of doing something that's very heavy and forced, so it still has that feeling of spontaneity, really. It doesn't want to be too regular. You can think of it in a sort of more march-like style, which will also work really well. But again, I think it's forte, not fortissimo, so just be careful not to give too much here. This whole section from figure 4 onwards to basically to where you've played all your top Ds at the end of page 3 is a huge build-up. So we want to start to create some real tension in the phrase. And I think if you're kind of blasting, it doesn't create that feeling of foreboding in what's to come. I'm just going to play a little bit from figure 5, just to give you an idea of how to cope with these sort of dynamic changes, but yet still keep this sense of line and direction through the phrase. Again, breathing has a really important role here, so have a listen to how the breathing can really sort of glue all of this music together. And then we arrive at figure 6, still only forte. So again, we've got fortissimos coming, and we want to just feel that we're still, there's still a way to go here. So think a warm, kind of broad sound, something not too, too hysterical, really. Again, little staccatos there. Don't miss them. Really, really easy to sort of just wash over these staccatos at the end of the triplet. Be really precise with those. Coming up also, we've got some accents. Bring those out as much as possible, almost kind of like little stings in that phrase there. We now come to my favourite section of the movement, really, where this final build-up is coming into its own. Again, just be sure that you're being very strict with your rhythm, your dotted rhythm. Ya da dee da da. As the music gets kind of even more exciting, it's even more important that we are not lazy with that rhythm, because that will change the character somewhat. And again, keeping your breathing as quick as possible, always as deep as possible, but very much what I would call a horizontal breath. So you're linking one bar with the next bar rather than creating holes here. The more you do that, the more we'll create excitement and this sense of almost like a pot is on the simmering plate but starting to boil. So by the end of the top Ds, we're boiling over, if you like. One little pointer about these runs up to the top Ds. It's very important that we don't rush them. Yeah, da 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 da. So I would just give that D a little kick halfway up. At speed, you won't really hear that, but it's kind of a little bit like musical scaffolding. It just keeps everything from toppling down into a big mess. Also there, just watch the upbeat to each of these pairs of triplets. The upbeat is not a triplet, so we don't want like that. We want, because the upbeat is a semiquaver, and I think that again is very important for the character that we're building here. It doesn't want to sound sort of sing-songy or too sort of easy. It wants to sound quite dramatic on that upbeat there. So be really sure that it's precise and not too fast. The last of these top Ds has an accent on it, so perhaps that one can feel almost a little bit more resonant than the others. Just give it a touch more length and perhaps a little bit of vibrato. So we really get that feeling that the note sort of goes on through the bar even though you've finished playing it. Now we come to the final page of the movement. Now we enter this figure that we had at the beginning, at figure 8, but here it's firstly marked piano, so we want something very different in terms of colour, and I think also in terms of mood, just for these first sort of 5 bars, bar before 8 and 4 bars at 8, it's almost like a memory of the opening, so quite sort of wistful, quite dreamy. And then you can come back up to mezzo forte and a bit more kind of confident, if you like. It's just lovely to change that colour, I think, for the first 4 bars, if possible. When we reach figure 9, we're rediscovering the second subject that we had near the beginning. So again, a lovely kind of calm, floating sound. Be very dotted with these rhythms again, so not too triplety. But then when there are different articulation marks, make sure that they come out. So for example, the tenutos at the end of bar 2 here. Go up 1 notch in dynamic, but again try that with just changing the vibrato. So something bit faster. So it will create a feeling that the dynamic is up one notch, but you don't have to do anything huge. Leave enough for the forte at the end of the phrase. So something a bit edgier for the forte, and then hollow it out again for the diminuendo at the end of the phrase. I love this last little section. These staccatos, imagine that that's the sound of a celesta or something very percussive, almost like a sort of glockenspiel sound. So we get them really short, but also really, really bouncy. So I would practice them diaphragm only, so that the majority of that note is being created here and not ta 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 ta, because that can become a little bit too heavy with the tongues doing all the work for you. Be very smooth then on the triplets that follow. It's almost like just like kind of a wave. So we want to create a feel that it's being thrown up in the air and it just kind of noodles back down, and then we have our staccatos again. The end of the movement is so beautiful. We have this sort of almost like a very, very distant reminiscence of the opening, but played obviously high on this top F to B flat, which is not easy, but in terms of technical things to avoid, be as open in the throat as you can. Really use your support so that you're not squeezing with the lips, so that we get this kind of trapped sound. We want something free as possible, so try and do all the work down here. I always think that the soft high register playing is a little bit like a swan kind of gliding on a lake. Under the water we have all this paddling, but you don't see any of that when you see the swan gliding around. It's a little bit like that with the top register for us. We just want to hear this sort of floating sound, so do all your work here. Then the last two notes, really simple, just an E and then down to the D, just over an octave below. But I think it has a kind of shrugging feel to it. So the E is sort of the shrug and the D is the answer to that. And end it with a warm sort of lifted sound. The D is obviously a very easy note to play flat at the end here. We don't want to be doing that. So keep your posture as lifted as possible so that you're not allowing the note to sink down. So it's setting the scene for the movements that are to come. It's not a closed book at all, the end of the first movement. There's a little sense of a question mark left for what's following. Thanks everyone, I hope that's been useful. A whistle-stop tour through the first movement of the Prokofiev, and I could probably talk for hours about this piece, but hopefully that gives you a few things to start thinking about. Really aim for as much character, variety and detail in your performance as you can. Good luck.